Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are opening up a topic that is, well, it's central to the life of faith, spiritual struggle.
Mhm.
Specifically, we're talking about those times of dejection, anxiety, and feeling just utterly abandoned.
Right.
We're going to be performing a deep dive into the 42nd Psalm, and for that, we're using the incredibly detailed and I think experiential exposition from Charles Spurgeon in the Treasury of David.
Yeah, and this is such a necessary deep dive. Psalm 42 is, you could argue, the most famous scripture dealing with what we might call spiritual depression or drought.
For sure.
So our mission today is pretty targeted. We want to dissect David's specific discipline method for coping with these trials, especially when he felt removed from God's perceived presence.
It's a method, not just an emotional outburst.
Exactly. The text, especially when Spurgeon illuminates it, gives us a very practical framework for understanding perseverance and sanctification within a reformed view. It pushes past just subjective feeling and really demands a reasoned faith.
Okay, let's unpack this then, because this isn't just a lament. The psalm itself has a title that sets it apart. So the psalm is dedicated to the chief musician, Maschil. Now, when we talk about a Maschil, we're not just talking about any old song for worship. What does that label and instructive ode tell us about what this psalm is trying to do?
Well, that word Maschil just fundamentally changes how we have to approach the text.
Right.
It means this song, even though it was born from this place of deep suffering, is actually meant to be a manual. It's an instruction guide for other people. David isn't just, venting his feelings.
He's documenting a lesson.
He is. Our source material really points out that the Maschil label suggests this psalm is especially for those whose path to heaven is difficult. It's for people who need wisdom and perseverance. This is practical theology put to verse. David is showing us step by step the kind of internal dialogue you need to have to move from despair toward hope.
So the very structure is an act of spiritual discipline. And even though the title doesn't explicitly name David, we're pretty confident about the authorship. What circumstances does Spurgeon think led to this?
Yeah, the source attributes this psalm firmly to David. It has his distinctive style all over it, that intense introspection, the rapid mood shifts.
Yeah, you can feel it.
You can. And the most likely historical setting, according to Spurgeon and many others, is when David was fleeing from Absalom.
Okay.
Now think about what that means. David the king is in exile. He's forced to cross the Jordan River, and he's physically cut off from the public ordinances, from God's house.
The very place he wants to be.
The very place he longs for communion. So yes, his enemies are after him, but the deeper wound, the real source of the pain, is that enforced distance from the ark, from Zion. So the song is giving instruction to a believer who is heartsick, not because he lost his throne, but because he lost the enjoyment of God's presence.
So the affliction is a physical exile, but the distress it causes is a purely spiritual thirst.
That's it, exactly.
Okay, now we have to turn to that dedication, because it's unique. A Maschil for the sons of Korah. Why this specific group of singers? It feels a little strange to assign a song of such deep dejection to this particular family line.
This is one of the most theologically resonant details of the entire psalm, and Spurgeon draws immense insight from it. The identity of the sons of Korah. It anchors the whole narrative in the doctrine of sovereign grace.
How so?
Well, if you remember the story from Numbers chapter 26, Korah himself rebels against Moses, and he's swallowed by the earth, along with his whole company.
A catastrophic judgment.
A huge one. But the text explicitly says, and this is the key verse, notwithstanding the children of Korah died not.
Ah, so they survived. A miraculous preservation.
Precisely. They are, as Spurgeon calls them, the spared ones of sovereign grace. They had no merit in their survival. It was nothing they did. It was God's mere good pleasure that preserved them from that judgment. And Spurgeon notes that their survival, their election to mercy, it filled them with such gratitude that they consecrated their lives, their entire lineage, to sacred music and to the glory of God. Their whole identity became a living memorial to the freeness of divine love.
So their very presence in the temple as musicians and singers was a kind of theological statement.
It was a statement about grace triumphing over deserved judgment.
And that connects back to the theme of this psalm.
It connects directly. The people best suited to sing a song that starts in the pit of despair and ends in triumphant hope are the ones who know firsthand that their rescue was completely undeserved. They're equipped to express this spiritual struggle because they know the worst judgment has already passed them by, securing their final victory. Their entire history is proof that God rescues the undeserving.
And the source material points out Their roles were even broader than just singing. They were involved in service even defense.
Yes. The Korahites were assigned these diverse, sometimes almost conflicting roles, which shows how comprehensive their dedication was. They were musicians. They were singers. Heman, one of the famous ones, was a Korahite. And as Psalm 84 alludes, they were keepers of the threshold of the tabernacle.
Guardians of the boundary.
Right, the physical boundary of God's presence. But what's really interesting is that First Chronicles describes some of them as fierce warriors, men whose faces were like the faces of lions who could wield a sword.
That's a fascinating combination. The musicians who are also lion-faced warriors.
And it perfectly reflects the nature of faith that we see in Psalm 42. It's both a lament, a song of struggle and sensitivity, and it's a courageous act of spiritual defiance.
Right.
The sons of Korah were tasked with both praising God and defending his sanctuary. So the Maschil is instructing us that spiritual discipline requires both the tenderness of a singer and the grit of a warrior, struggling against despair while holding fast to the theological certainty of our preservation.
All right, let's move into the heart of the psalm. Verse 1 gives us that unforgettable imagery. As the hart panteth after the water brooks, so panteth my soul after thee, O God. This isn't just a minor inconvenience. This is desperation defined.
Yeah, and Spurgeon really urges us to look beyond just the general idea of being thirsty. The image is specific, and it's intense.
Okay.
This is not just a deer in a dry season. It's a hunted hart,
Mhm.
a deer that has been pursued by dogs, by hunters, for a long, long distance. Its flanks are steaming. They're smoking from the desperate run. Its breath is ragged.
Wow.
It needs water not just for a quick drink, but to lave its body, to cool its fever, and to escape the dogs that will definitely overtake it if it doesn't get to that water. It's a matter of life or death right now.
That completely changes the analogy. David isn't just saying, oh, I wish I could commune with God. He's saying, I must have God or I will perish.
Yes.
I'll perish at the hands of my enemies and my own spiritual exhaustion. It's an absolute necessity.
The craving is portrayed as this almost animalistic, absolute instinct for self-preservation. And when the desire for God is that visceral, that natural, and that desperate, the source material says it is well with our souls, however painful our feelings. This panting is a perpetual consuming appetite. It's a spiritual state marked by what he calls a sweet bitterness. The believer is unhappy until he possesses the enjoyment of God's presence. This deep, unquenchable desire. That intensity is held up as a verifiable mark of grace.
And then David immediately refines the object of this craving in verse 2. My soul thirsteth for God, for the living God. He's very specific about who he needs.
He clarifies the objective because a true Maschil has to be precise. The thirst is for God himself.
Not just for church or for religious services.
Not at all. Not for the tabernacle, not even for the comforting presence of other believers. David needs the perennial fountain of life, light, and love. And the source contrasts this true thirst with, say, the desires of the worldly man. The worldly man thirsts for dead idols, gold, honor, pleasure, things that can never really quench the soul.
Right.
But the true spiritual man, even when he's dejected, finds those alternatives just loathsome.
Now, why does the source take such pains to distinguish thirst from hunger?
Well, thirst is described as a condition that is more awful than hunger. A person can manage hunger for a long time. It's painful, sure, but it's sometimes bearable. Thirst, on the other hand, it's insatiable, it's clamorous, and if it's not quenched, it's deadly and quickly.
So the analogy confirms that this craving for God isn't optional, it's a life requirement.
It is. And if we claim to be believers, but we don't feel any of that intense, clamorous craving, we should probably question the authenticity of our piety.
And this leads to his question about participation. When shall I come and appear before God? This really touches on the Reformed appreciation for public ordinances.
It does, and it raises a critical point about ritual versus reality. True piety longs for the public assemblies because they are appearances before God.
Not before the minister.
Not just before the minister or the music or the comfort of friends. The question for us, for you listening, is whether we seek the face of God in our assemblies or something less compelling. David saw coming before God in the assembly as the highest good, an urgent, life-sustaining need. And this longing for visible communion, it really acts as a critique of any worship that prioritizes the outward form over that inner experience of seeing and being seen by the living God.
That intense, unquenched desire then clashes immediately with the affliction he describes in the first part of verse 3. My tears have been my meat day and night.
Yeah, the physical manifestation of his grief is just extreme.
Yeah.
David's sorrow has completely replaced his physical appetite. His tears are constant. The source describes them as his meat, filling his cup and his plate continually. They're described as salt meats, but healthful to the soul, because they signify the earnestness and the authenticity of his distress. This open pouring out of grief, while it's painful, is suggested to be better than what he calls dry grief, that silent, internalizing sorrow that finds no release. His soul is just melting because he's physically separated from God's house.
But the real pain, the spiritual dagger, comes in the second half of that verse. While they continually say unto me, where is thy God?
And this is the critical spiritual attack. It's incessant, they say it daily, and it's calculated with pure malice.
Yeah.
The wicked know exactly where to strike a servant of God. They recognize that the worst possible misfortune for a believer would be the loss of God's favor. So they don't attack David's health or his political standing. They go right for the jugular. They impugn God's faithfulness and, by extension, David's character and his faith.
It's an attempt to shake his foundational confidence in his covenant relationship with God.
Absolutely. The taunt is designed to cause division, to labor, to separate David's heart from God. It's the same ancient strategy used against Christ, if they'll be the Son of God. The enemies are trying to provoke David into calling God's faithfulness into question, and they show their own ignorance of divine providence by assuming that suffering must mean abandonment. God often shows himself most intimately, most certainly, in exactly these contrary conditions.
Yeah.
But the taunt is continuous, and it cuts deeper than any physical injury. As David himself confirms later in verse 10, it's as with a sword in my bones. It's aimed to destroy the very root of his hope.
So, faced with this constant spiritual warfare, David then turns inward in verse 4. He says, when I remember these things, I pour out my soul in me, for I had gone with the multitude, with the voice of joy and praise.
And here we see the pain of memory.
Ah.
David is recollecting the exhilaration of past seasons of grace mingling with the pious throne, that joyful ascent up Mount Zion, collective songs of praise during the holy days. But tragically, in his present state of exile, these memories only serve to intensify his current gloom. The contrast is just too stark. Where there was Zion, there's now a wilderness. Where there was song, there's now the sneer of the enemy.
And where there was joy, there's just lament.
Exactly. The recollection, while it's an understandable reaction, it's not providing him any solace.
And the source material offers a big caution about this, doesn't it? Describing the result as pouring out the soul in me. What's Spurgeon's critique of this inward turning?
Yeah, Spurgeon identifies this as the trap of useless introspection. When David pours his soul out in himself, he's essentially turning his heart inward. He's melting into self-pity, just continually harping on his woes. And this, the source says, is of no value. It's like a prisoner on a treadwheel. You expend immense effort, but it achieves nothing. It doesn't move the prisoner any closer to real consolation. So self-pitying recollection, while it's a natural reaction, is totally insufficient for spiritual rescue. The remedy has to be active and outward-looking.
So the soul needs something external to cling to. And this leads right into the active spiritual discipline in verse 5, which is really the heart of the Maschil's instruction, this self-expostulation.
Right.
Why art thou cast down, O my soul? And why art thou disquieted within me?
This is the vital transition. He moves from weeping about his soul to talking to his soul. He treats himself, as Spurgeon says, as though he were two men.
One anxious, one faithful.
Exactly. One is the anxious, dejected man. The other is the man of disciplined faith who is reasoning against his own fear. This movement, this chiding the soul out of the dumps, is defined as the best surgery for grief. It demands the heart give an account for its agitation.
And the source also gives us that critical insight into the Hebrew phrasing here, which changes the emphasis completely.
Yes, this is huge. The Hebrew active voice allows the question to be read not just passively, why art thou cast down, but actively. Why bowest thou down thyself, my soul? And that insight is central to the Maschil's teaching. It implies that we are often not just passive victims of trial, but that we actively participate in creating or deepening our own needless trouble and distress.
How so?
Through an undue focus on our fluctuating circumstances or our feelings, David is holding his own heart responsible for its unnecessary tumult.
So the core of the discipline is recognizing that the causes for alarm are often magnified by our ignorance or our failure to apply theological truths that we already know. And then David immediately issues the command, the prescription, hope thou in God.
And that is the necessary spiritual surgery. Hope is the grace that is commanded. Spurgeon calls it the grace that swims, though the waves roar and be troubled.
Sorry about that.
And the foundation for this hope is entirely external to David. It's God himself who is unchangeable. And therefore, this hope remains unshaken regardless of the external storm. It's not sustained by physical comfort or immediate relief, but by these secret visitations of God which sustain the spirit. Even if every earthly evil were loosed, hope, anchored in God's immutability, remains.
And this command is then followed by this assertion of future certainty. For I shall yet praise him. That's a powerful statement of perseverance.
It's a declaration that the current loss of the sense of God's love is not a loss of the love itself.
That's a key distinction.
A critical one. Hope anticipates the future and knows its title to salvation is secure even when the deed feels, unreadable in the present gloom. David is anticipating the exchange of his present sighs for future songs, his lament for a triumphal paean. This demonstrates true sanctification, the ability to look past the immediate feelings of dejection toward the promised certainty of future glory.
And the specific object of this anticipation is salvation through the help of his countenance. Why the focus on the countenance, on the face?
The countenance signifies the propitious face of God. It means God's smile, his visible approval, his favor. This is David's main hope and chief desire. He isn't just hoping for rescue by some distant hand. He is hoping for the intimate return of God's favor. When God's face shines on him, his low spirits will be restored, and his enemies will be put to scorn. The source rightly hails this as an act of heroism, to assert such confidence in the very hour of your greatest gloom. It confirms that the greatest blessing is the return of the Lord's visible favor. But despite that robust self-expostulation, the struggle immediately returns. And the Maschil acknowledges this reality of the Christian life, that internal peace is not always permanent. Verse 6 opens right back on that bass note of dejection. Oh my God, my soul is cast down within me. The spasm of despondency is back.
This is such a crucial point for the learner. If self-expostulation is a spiritual discipline, how does Spurgeon reconcile its necessity with the fact that David's dejection just comes right back? He has to start the argument all over again.
Yeah, it illustrates the difference between assurance and feeling. The discipline works, but the human heart and the external pressures are relentless. David recognizes that if he looks inward for comfort, all he finds are fickle frames and poor provender.
Yeah.
So his response this time is immediate and disciplined. He says, "Therefore will I remember thee." The downcasting, though it's painful, it immediately drives him to fly to the rock, away from self-pity.
And this memory is tied to specific, deliberate locations, from the land of Jordan and of the Hermonites, from the hill Mizar. Why the insistence on geographical memory?
He's practicing what we could call the cordial of past grace. He is strategically recalling specific occasions of past, choice communion with God.
Oh.
For a fainting spirit, storing up these memories of conversing with heaven acts as a necessary medicine. The places themselves, Jordan, Hermon, Mizar, they become sacred not because of the land itself, but because God met him there.
So he's creating an internal spiritual map.
Exactly. The Hermonites, historically, that's where God had given great victories, like the defeat of Sihon and Og. And Mizar, which was probably an insignificant low hill, it likely represents a time of the nearest, most intimate fellowship for David.
So not always on the great mountaintops.
No, often in the quiet, humble valleys. The wisdom here is that a true heavenly heart will count any place, no matter how humble. As sacred as Zion, if God chooses to manifest himself there. David is using God's faithfulness in the past as a guaranteed promise for the present.
Okay, now the imagery in verse 7, it just ratchets up the sense of danger, describing the totality of his affliction. Deep calleth unto deep at the noise of thy waterspouts. All thy waves and thy billows are gone over me. This is a graphic depiction of a total deluge.
This is a masterclass in conveying overwhelming woe. The waterspout imagery, which was a known and terrifying phenomenon on the coast of Judea, suggests the billow is following billow, just incessantly.
It's not one single thing.
No, he's not experiencing one single affliction, but a confluence of woes. It's as if heaven, earth, and hell are all conspiring against his peace. The deeps above and below clasp hands, uniting all his afflictions. Bodily pain, mental fear, satanic suggestions, outward tribulation. They're all merging into this one dreadful conspiracy against the quiet of his soul.
He feels completely submerged, like a lonely mariner caught in an Atlantic roller with no chance to catch his breath.
It's a profound, deep experience, often unknown to those new in grace, but it's common to those who do business on the great waters of affliction. However, in the midst of this terrifying description, David immediately finds his theological anchor. He shifts the ownership of the storm.
With that one small phrase, all thy waves and thy billows are gone over me. Why is that shift in ownership so critical for him?
That phrase highlights the absolute, unassailable sovereignty of God over every single trial. David doesn't attribute the waves to chance, or to the enemy's malice alone, or to random misfortune. He attributes them to God.
They are thy waves.
They are. And that recognition means every trial is sent, it's measured, and it's directed by him. They are achieving his designs. For the afflicted believer, especially operating within a reformed view of providence, knowing that his troubles are confined within the bounds of a sovereign, loving decree, it leads to quiet resignation.
It changes the nature of suffering from meaningless chaos to targeted, purposeful discipline.
Exactly. Now, we should acknowledge that, according to the source, David exaggerates slightly. Only Christ has truly had all the breaking waves of Jehovah pass over him in the fullness of divine wrath. But for the believer, the fact that the trials are his sis means they are ultimately beneficial. The knowledge that God directs the waterspout is the key to endurance.
And the certainty of God's intention is immediately declared in verse 8, which speaks of a sovereign decree of mercy. Yet the Lord will command his loving kindness in the daytime.
This concept is incredibly powerful. God doesn't just grant mercy passively, he issues a sovereign decree. His loving kindness is a noble life belt in a rough sea. The idea of God commanding it implies it's a royal donative, ordained of old for the elect, ensuring that no heir of grace is ever entirely forsaken. The day may darken to midnight, but God will, with authority, command mercy to be reserved and manifested for his chosen people.
And this decree extends beyond just the visible comfort of the day. It continues into the darkness, and in the night his song shall be with me.
God is the God of the night season as well as the day. No amount of stress or trial is capable of preventing this special commanded love. Even when the external world is dark and frightening, a song of praise for blessings received, a song born of assurance, it will cheer the gleam. And David describes his spiritual practice here, and my prayer unto the God of my life. This teaches us that prayer has to be yoked with praise, and it's directed toward the God of my life, meaning the author, the sustainer, and the object of his entire existence. To know that both our painful sighs and our confident songs have free access to our glorious Lord, that is the ultimate reason for hope, even in the most difficult spiritual condition. So having found his stability in God's command over the storm, David then channels his renewed strength into this direct inquiry in verse 9. I will say unto God my rock, why hast thou forgotten me?
He doesn't stop questioning the affliction, but he retains this absolute grip on his confidence. He calls God his rock, his only refuge, his only true confidence, even when he can't feel any present sense of that refuge.
And that is the crucial balance of faith. It's the language of feeling, not the language of judgment or disbelief.
Okay.
Faith is permitted to inquire of God about the causes of his perceived displeasure. David holds fast to God as his rock while asking the difficult question. And the inquiry, why go I mourning because of the oppression of the enemy? It's pragmatic. The Lord condescends to be pleaded with. He allows this question so that the believer can search out the causes of the severity. To know the reason for the sorrow is, in part, to know how to endure it as the trial unfolds God's specific design for your sanctification.
And his inquiry immediately reminds him of that most persistent affliction in verse 10, bringing the taunt right back into focus. As with a sword in my bones, mine enemies reproach me, while they say daily unto me, where's thy God? The psychological cruelty of this is just relentless.
It's a deep wound. The source stresses that these cruel mockeries cut deeper than the flesh. They reach the soul as though a rapier were pricking the heart's vital center. And the continuous daily repetition of where is thy God is the unkindest cut of all, because it reflects directly on the Lord's faithfulness.
Yeah.
His enemies are completely ignorant of the mysteries of divine providence. They just assume that if David is suffering, God must be absent. David's resort to prayer, using these very persecutions as a plea to God, is the only escape from what would otherwise be maddening despair.
So having fully traversed this abyss, questioned the causes, weathered the taunts, David returns to the self-expostulation one final time in verse 11. He's echoing the instruction from the beginning of the Maschil. Why art thou cast down, O my soul, and why art thou disquieted within me?
And this final repetition isn't redundant, it's definitive. The rehearsal of his sorrow, when it's finally looked at squarely by disciplined faith, it shows him that there is no sufficient ground for yielding entirely to despondency. His fears dwindle when they are looked in the face. The self-chiding is repeated with authority, demanding that the heart cease its internal tumult, and the command is issued again. Hope thou in God. The anchor still keeps its hold because God is faithful and God is love, regardless of David's current spiritual feeling.
And that final declaration signals a growth, a deeper assurance than the first time David spoke the phrase back in verse 5. The closing assertion is, "Who is the health of my countenance and my God?"
That addition, "and my God," is the triumphant closing note. It shows that the writer has grown in confidence, in conviction. It provides a direct, defiant, and immediate reply to the enemy's incessant taunt, "Where is thy God?"
He's answering them.
He's answering them directly. David is declaring, "He is here, even here now. I am not ashamed to own him amid your sneers and your taunts." This is faith closing the struggle, proclaiming victory by anticipation. The final lesson is that the health and the life of one's grace lie not in the grace itself, which, as we saw, can be fickle, but in God, who remains his covenanted God.
So the knowledge that salvation, the restoration of the countenance, is secured by an unchangeable God that provides the ultimate theological stability against all this psychological and spiritual turmoil.
Indeed. The saddest countenance shall yet be made to shine through a firm reliance on God's salvation. He's a skillful physician who simultaneously comforts and strengthens nature while evacuating the disease. The perseverance of the saint is maintained not by the strength of the saint, but by the decree and the command of the sovereign Lord.
This deep dive into the Maschil of Psalm 42 has provided such essential instruction for anyone facing spiritual drought. The major nuggets of knowledge we've pulled from Spurgeon's exposition today are, well, they're very clear. The desperate, absolute necessity of thirst for the living God, a thirst that is itself a mark of grace. Then the requirement to move past useless introspection and to engage in that discipline of chiding one's own heart, asserting theological certainty over unstable feeling. And finally, the deep comfort that comes from knowing God maintains sovereign command, labeling every single waterspout and billow as his.
And for you, the learner, I think you should carry this provocative thought forward. Spurgeon notes that David's dejection was often self-imposed, as suggested by that act of translation. Why bowest thou down thyself?
Right.
So consider how much of modern spiritual struggle and disquietude, that internal chaos, is not a necessary God-inflicted trial, but is actually self-imposed trouble. Trouble stemming from prioritizing our fluctuating subjective feelings over the objective, unchangeable title of hope we possess in God, our sovereign rock. The discipline of faith requires us to stop bowing down ourselves and start commanding our hearts to hope.
That is an essential distinction between feeling and faith to meditate on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the instructive ode of Psalm 42. We invite you to continue that meditation.